Great. So here it is. I hope you can see my screen and hear. Excellent. So the topic is the growing need for emotional intelligence. Okay. Now, she's already given the intro. I typically have a slide, but I'm going to skip through it because she's mentioned all of it. I'm not going to. That's the book, by the way, in case you're interested. It's available on Amazon or Flipkart or any of these platforms. You can. And I'll be very happy if you kind of read it and give me your feedback. Yeah, it's set more in the Indian context. Okay, so let's jump right in. So my favorite thing is what I call the knowing doing gap. Okay, and many of you would have heard this. Human beings are very complex. You know, it's not about knowing. And when I do any of these sessions, I say, hey, and I'm going to tell you something which you don't know. If you don't know, in case you don't know, you can always Google it up and find it. So the question is not really about knowing, it's about doing. And there is a big gap. Anybody who's taken a New Year resolution, since it's a New Year, knows exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. Marketers know this very well. They make you sign up for a gym membership for the whole year. January, everybody goes, and then February, it starts tapering off. By March, it's kind of back to square one. The question is, why is that? Why is there a big gap between knowing and doing? And there could be multiple reasons for it, right? So I might know and I may not agree, but I might agree, I may not understand. I may understand, I may not be convinced. I may be convinced, but I may not be committed, right? So there is a huge gap between knowing and doing. And I think what matters when it comes to leadership is commitment, right? And how do you build commitment? So let's talk a bit more about that, okay? Now, the point is, let me walk you a little bit through what is called the creative economy. And this is a brilliant framework from Gary Hammer, who was one of the big management gurus. And he said, essentially, there are three types of economies. There is an industrial economy, then you have a knowledge economy, and then you have a creative economy. And I think he said this years back, but I think it holds true even today, very much true, right? And this is not, it's not that it's happening in some remote part of the world or only in the Silicon Valley. It's happening everywhere. Like I'm based out of Bangalore. I see all of these, right? You have the industrial complexes like Apenia, which is doing industrial economy. There's a whole bunch of IT parks strewn over the city, which is nothing but a knowledge economy. Kind of industrial, but you have a layer of knowledge coming in, right? So if you're a Java programmer, you need to bring in Java skills. And then you have all these startups, which are creative economy, right? Now, in any industry, it doesn't matter which industry you are, there could be parts of each of them, right? There could be parts of industrial, there could be parts of knowledge, or there could be parts of the creative economy, yeah? Now, the point is, these are the three economies which you see on the right. What he also said is on the left side, he said, these are the characteristics or the employee traits that are required as you move up the economies. Okay, so it was all about obedience, diligence, and intellect. Obedience, diligence was okay. You come in at 9 o'clock, you punch your 9 hours, you go out. That's obedience, right? Diligence is okay. If you're given a job, at least you do it to completion, use some of your brain power, whatever. Intellect was, of course, the edge that you got in, as in if you're a Java programmer, as I said, you need to bring in Java skills. That's intellect. But interestingly, what happens is as you move up the value chain, it's about initiative, creativity, and passion. And this is, to me, a fundamental shift because you can command the other ones, right? You can command somebody saying, hey, you know what? You need to make sure that you're coming in on time and punching in 9 hours. But can you command somebody saying, hey, you know what? Come Monday morning, you better have passion. Yeah. Or better have creativity at the workplace? No, you can't command that because these are emotions. Okay. And that's a fundamental shift that's happening. The more we are in the creative economy, and today it doesn't matter which economy, which company you're in, which industry you're in. And I give this example of the car industry, the automobile industry. Just see what's happening today. It's completely getting disrupted. New technology, new launches. So the point is, you might think you're a mundane industry, like a pure automobile couldn't have been more industrial, but suddenly it's catapulted to a creative economy. So if we all believe that, yes, we are more in the creative economy, these kind of characteristics become more important. And that is why emotions suddenly start playing a big role. Yeah, makes sense? Okay, let's move on. Now, if I talk to the knowing doing gap. So if I plot that on an axis, let's say knowing is on the y-axis on top, which is knowledge, and you have management or the doing on the lower part. So that's the y-axis. And if I plot the x-axis, which is self and others, what I get is basically 4 quadrants. So it starts with knowledge of self, which is nothing but self-awareness. Okay. Once you have that, then it's basically self-awareness or self-management, as it's called. These two put together is called self-mastery. Okay. Once you have that, it's about knowledge of others, called social awareness, also called empathy. And once we build that, it's finally about management of others, which is nothing but relationship building. Now, as you would have guessed, this is the framework of emotional intelligence. I love this framework for multiple reasons. One is that each one builds on the other. It's very simple to understand. Okay. It starts with the foundation of self-awareness. Only when you are self-aware can you regulate yourself. And only when we can regulate ourselves and be aware of ourselves can we really start building empathy with people. And all of these culminate to relationship building. Okay. And that is why, and in my book also, I talk a lot more on the why. And here today also, given the limited time, I'm going to focus quite a bit on the why rather than the what and how. Like I can tell you, okay, you need to do this, this, and this for EQ. But the question is, are we really convinced? Remember the word I used, commitment. The commitment will not get built unless we are absolutely certain that we need this. And it's a different world we are living in today. This is becoming very critical. Okay. Now, when I say critical, it's not just me saying it. The World Economic Forum publishes a list of top 10 skills which are used globally. Every 5 years, they come up with a list. 2015 is the one, what you see in the right. There are parts of EQ, but in 2020, they came up with emotional intelligence as one of the key ones. So there's a global understanding and awareness and recognition that EQ is going to be very critical. Okay. Now, we all have two sides to us, isn't it? We have a head and we have a heart. Now, the point is, if one side is rational, the other side is, of course, emotional. If one side is about thought, the other side is about feelings. And if the left side is IQ, the right side is more of EQ. Though the last one is not exactly technically right, because EQ has a lot of IQ also related. I mean, you cannot have EQ without IQ. Okay. But EQ talks about feelings, and that's why I've put it on the right-hand side. Okay. Now, we take decisions which are based on both rational and emotional, correct? Okay. So now he says the rational brain is not good at being rational. What it's good at is rationalizing what the emotional brain has already decided. Okay. And I'm not saying this. This is one of the world-renowned figures on decision-making who's saying this. And this is often a light bulb moment for people, especially for senior leaders. You know, when I show this, they say, oh, what are you saying? Are you saying I'm more emotional than rational? Why is that? You know, emotional has always had a negative place, has always had a lower place than rational. We take pride in saying we are very rational people. When people get emotional, what's the first thing that you do? When somebody gets emotional at work, hey, don't get emotional, calm down, okay? Calm down, be rational. Rational always in the pecking order was above the emotional. And suddenly, thanks to neuroscience and what we are understanding is that emotions have a huge role to play. In fact, the research is showing it's far more important than the rational mind. And this has huge implications to us as leaders. Okay. Let me tell you another story, which will probably kind of, reinforce what I'm saying. So there is this neuroscientist, his name is Antonio Damas. He's an Italian neuroscientist. He was working on patients who had damage in parts of their brain which controlled emotions. So the rational side was intact. Okay. Now, if you ask these people were perfectly normal. If you speak to them, they're perfectly normal because the rational brain is intact. If you ask them a simple question, they would give you a response, right? Let's say you ask them, what would you like to eat? And, so what is there? Let's say you have chicken and fish, and they'll tell you the pros and cons of chicken and fish. The rational side would immediately say that. But if you ask them, what would you like to eat? They used to struggle. And this was like a huge thing for Antonio Damas. He said, what is this happening? Why is it that these people are not able to take a decision, even though their rational brain is intact? Okay. And this led to the discovery. He says the rational drives us to options, but emotions move us to action. The decision to pick something, which is the ultimate thing in decision making, is actually an emotional brain decision. It's not rational. Rational is very good in looking at all the options available and doing a pros and cons analysis or cost benefit analysis, all of that. But when it comes to picking, it's the rational, it's the emotional brain that that wins out. Believe me, it was a journey for me as well when I went through it. Mahua talked about my IIT IIM. I jokingly say I learned none of this in IIT IIMs. Okay, this was like a new world opening up for me. Okay, because I used to always take pride in being very rational. I was very analytical. That's the first thing I would mention in an interview. I'm a very analytical person. In fact, there's a story, I'll not narrate it right now, as to which for me was a turning point, where in one of the, I was joining a company and I had to go through a rigorous process, and something the person said, and it was like, oh boy, what is he talking about? What is he talking about emotions? Emotions has no place. It's all about rational. Anyway, coming back, I want all of you to dwell on this. This is very important. And this is very important for us as leaders, because if we feel that we can keep emotions at work and come to work, emotions at home and come to work, it's not going to cut it. In the creative economy, it's not going to cut it. You cannot convince or influence people just with rational, because it'll move them to options, but it will not move them to action. Absolutely critical to understand. Okay, good. So now we are at the, we kind of looked at the EQ, the what and why, right? Now, I want you to remember those 4 quadrants, right? Starts with self-awareness, self-management, empathy, relationship building. Let's start with empathy, and then we'll kind of tie it back to the self-awareness and self-regulation. So just take a few seconds to go through this. It's a classic Dilbert joke, right? And what happened to all of this to Johan? Well, it didn't come out. Well, that's how our transactions are, isn't it? We are very transactional. It doesn't come up. Anything other than the work doesn't come up. And this is becoming more true as we are working more virtually. While the need is to have more empathy, but often we have lesser empathy. Because the typical tendency is to pick up the phone and tell me, where are you with this? Or where are you with the numbers? Now, empathy doesn't feature anywhere, right? Now, what is empathy? Let's start with what is empathy. I keep saying that when I wrote the book a few years back, empathy was a nice to have. Today, suddenly companies are saying it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. Something has fundamentally shifted, and thanks to the pandemic, empathy is right at the forefront. Everybody's talking of empathy. Let's understand, what is empathy? It's the ability to understand, identify, and feel another's situation, concerns, and motives. So it's about identifying, understanding, as well as feeling. So there is a cognitive side and there is a emotional side. So what they call a cognitive empathy and an emotional empathy, okay? Or an affective empathy. A person expresses sympathy, but shares empathy, okay? So cognitive empathy is a lot like perspective taking. Sometimes you understand. Have you had bosses like that? You walk into the room and the boss knows, and he says, I know exactly what you're thinking. And they can somehow read your mind. They know exactly what you're thinking. Cognitive empathy, very high cognitive empathy. Yeah. Affective empathy is when you're feeling what the other person is feeling. That's affective empathy. So it's a person expresses sympathy, but shares empathy. Empathy is far deeper, and it helps forge more meaningful connections between individuals or between a leader and his team members. Again, I said it's a good to have. I've had this discussion sometimes, very senior leaders have come and told me on the side, hey, Suman, what you're saying makes sense. I've read your book. I'm normally this, but when I'm stressed or if things are going out of hand, I default to my, I go back to my default behaviors, which is essentially saying that all that evaporates, right? So it's very difficult. These things, as I said, knowing, doing, it's very easy to know, but extremely difficult to do. And that's where our mindfulness, and how do we do that? And those are separate sessions that we do, but I'm focusing more on the why. Those becomes very, very important, very critical, but very difficult to actually imbibe and do on a daily basis. So if you look at the continuum, it starts with sympathy, then you have empathy, and then you have compassion. And the very simple difference is one is only about thoughts. The empathy is when you're just not thinking, but you're feeling with the other person, right? And there is a neuroscience behind it as to, how you feel what the other person feels. And then there's compassion, which goes beyond the thinking and feeling, which is where you get into action. So compassion is basically the next step. Now, I want to narrate another simple story. So there was a guy sitting in, he was in the, sitting on a bench in the park. And there was a runner who was walking past and asked this guy, what is the time? And he looked at his watch, and he told this guy the time. And this runner went off. About just less than a minute later, this another runner came by and incidentally asked the same guy, what is the time? And this guy again looked at his watch, looked at it for some time, and told him the time. And once this runner went off, the guy who was sitting next to him in the bench asked him, hey, I'm just curious. You already knew the time. Why did you have to look at the watch and tell him this time? And this guy said, well, I knew the time, but that guy didn't know that I had seen the time. So if I had just told him the time, he wouldn't believe me. He wouldn't trust me. Yeah. So essentially what he was doing, he's constantly processing stuff from the other person's point of view. Yeah. To me, that goes to the core of empathy. Are you really looking at things constantly from the other person's point of view? Are you only looking at it from your point of view? Yeah. Let's say I'm doing a presentation. Am I only living in my head and thinking how it is going, or am I constantly kind of checking for body language, checking for understanding, checking, how things are, whether what I'm saying is actually getting communicated? Are you putting yourself in the other person's shoes? Are you getting into their world? That is empathy. Empathy is not like a very, we need to demystify it. Empathy, a lot of people feel it's, oh no, it's very high tech. We don't need this. But this goes to the core of relationships. It goes to the core of design thinking. It's about understanding where the other person is coming from. Yeah. So I find this story to be very powerful. Let's also talk about what empathy is not, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what empathy is. It is not about agreeing. I find a lot of leaders say, you know what, I don't want to be empathetic because I don't want to be seen as, I don't want to be seen as agreeing, to be weak. And I'm saying it's nothing of those. It's about agreeing does not mean I agree with you. It only means I understand. And there's a big gap between them. It does not mean that I'm weak. In fact, interestingly, having empathy makes you stronger. And I'll tell you why. Once in my session, I asked a simple question. I said, tell me the people of all the leaders or bosses that you've had, who are the people who had the maximum impact or maximum dent on your life? And I could see the energy. They would get up, they took a few minutes to write it down. They would come to the front of the class and actually narrate it with a lot of passion and energy. And interestingly, a lot of those things were said, a lot of them said, my boss was really ruthless and he would kind of, used to drive me to tremendous, he would really push me hard. And I said, well, if he pushed you so hard, how come you think of him as your best manager? And he said, and they would say that because that guy had my back in, he had my back, right? He was doing it for myself. He was doing it for me, So when people feel that you care, you can actually, you can be a big taskmaster. So it doesn't have to go the other way. You don't have to be lenient. You can be, but as long as people feel that you care, and then you're doing it for them and not for yourself. Okay, so very interesting. So it's not about being weak. It's not about being passive. It's about being assertive. Yeah. So empathy does not make you weaker. It actually makes you stronger.